I had been sent north with a small survey party in the winter of 1864 into the fringe of the Siberian tundra, where Nenets herders kept their reindeer and spoke in low tones about a pale thing seen at the tree line. We arrived to frozen camps and a mounting unease. The herders warned us not to travel after dusk, and the ledger I kept filled with entries that grew shorter as the sightings multiplied. I led a foreman party under a provincial surveyor's commission. With me were Petrov, steady at the sextant Alexei, who tended the chronometer and the charts, and Nestor, who managed the canvas and the campfires. Our kit was as ordinary as any civic survey in that year. A brass sextant whose vernier clicked with familiar authority. A pocket chronometer wound each morning. Canvas tents, bolts of oiled cloth for ground sheets and shelter. An assortment of the surveyor's prismatic compasses, folding theodolites lashed in oilskin, and 2 sledges hauled by reindeer for provisions. We had flint and steel, a ration of hardtack and salted meat, lamp oil for the lanterns, and the provincial seal that legitimized our passage across trading posts and alongside fur trade encampments. Our object was precise and prosaic: to chart a caravan route and to record grazing ranges so the fur merchants might place their leases with less violence to stock and man. We travelled by day when wind permitted, threading the fringe between larch stands and open tundra, making noon observations and fixing latitudes by the sun's angle while Petrov read our declinations. At night, we kept watch logs by lamp and lantern. I recorded wind force, compass variation, distance run by sledge, and the condition of the lead reindeer. The ledger began in a steady hand and long measured sentences. 47,12 N, noon sun, reduced sledge. 14 versts from the Voikov trading post. Herders camped at tree line with 10 animals. The Nenets we hired did not much alter their faces at our instruments, but they watched the country as hunters watch game. 3 of them, drawn men in fur, their faces rimed with frost, led our draft reindeer and handled the lines with an economy of motion born of long winters. They spoke to one another in soft Nenets, and to us through a thin interpreter in a Russian trade dialect. It was their pauses, their small shakes of the head, which first put Petrov and me on edge. Not after dusk, they said, in the broken Russian that had become familiar. White at the trees. It comes close with no step and no hunger sound. Small human things steadied us. We mended a torn tent flap beside a lamp that stank of whale oil. Alexei adjusted the chronometer until it agreed within a whisper. Nestor boiled a tea that tasted only of tannin and camp smoke, and we drank it in curt, grateful sips. The reindeer stamped and blew, their breath fogging the air. Harness bells tinkled against the sledge runners like a watchful metronome. The country smelled of larch resin and the iron of frozen ground. Night brought a glitter of stars so bright, Petrov swore he could sight by one alone. But after dusk, the herders drew their fires lower and shut their tents as though they might keep a thing out. The first recorded sighting that I witnessed was at the tree line, just before the great dark settled. We had halted to take bearings. A thin wind moved through the larches. One of the Nenets, whose hands were calloused like old rope, pointed without a word. At the limit of our lantern pool, there came a pale patch, no taller than a man at first. Then it unfolded like a sheet lifting from the ground, white against bark and snow. It moved no sound. The reindeer at the near sledge halted, ears down, eyes bright and wide. The bell jangle ceased as if pulled underwater. I raised the sextant because that is what one does against the implacable unknown. Measure, name, record. The instrument caught nothing but a quadrant of pale light. I could make no bearing for it. The chronometer kept its tick, and the world kept its physics. And yet the thing at the trees stood without step and without shadow. After that entry, my handwriting shortened nights grew more frequent, with sightings reported by the Nanettes alone, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 in a stretch of cold wind, and our watch rotations tightened. We began to avoid travel after dusk, despite routes to be fixed and grazing lines to be drawn. The ledger showed a narrowing of sentences and a widening of hesitation. We resolved to take a formal observation at first light, to approach the tree line with instruments and men, to name the pale thing if it would permit naming. Petrov tightened the straps on the brass sextant. The Nenets closed their lips, as one who carries a story they would sooner not tell. Dawn would come, and with it we would push the line between mapped land and the thing the herders saw. The night closed in and the lanterns guttered, and I could not write more that evening without the sound of quiet moving in the larch beyond our camp. The land beyond the last birch scrub ran flat and white under a low sky. The cold cut through wool and fur, and the aurora made the long nights an odd greenish light. Our commission from the Imperial Geographical Society had been explicit. Chart the reindeer routes, gather ethnographic notes, measure magnetic variation, and return specimens if any were to be had. It was March of 1912 when I made my camp upon the Yamal Plain with 3 Nenets guides, 2 assistants from the academy, a plate camera packed in oiled leather, a brass sextant, chronometer set to St. Petersburg time, and a Mosin Nagant slung beneath my greatcoat. We moved by sledge, the runners greased with bone fat, the harnesses lighted by the answers the reindeer gave to their names. At sunset, the Nenets' men grew silent. They refused to take their usual paths, and I ceased my own mapping and watched them instead. The shaman, Urvan by name, sat with fingers careful and small as he drew lines in the snow, making gestures I could not translate, but which he punctuated with spit and low words. An elder, Tolo, muttered of a white stranger that walked between the drift and the sky, a thing seen by moonless hunters and by children who later woke with their breath frozen to their lips. My assistants glanced nervously toward the tree line. The camera remained packed. We kept vigil in the tent that night. Kerosene lamps smoked tea brewed. I checked the chronometer and wrote notes by the light of an oil lantern. At 2 in the morning, a noise came. No howl, no mammal's cry, but a soft, immense displacement of air, as if a weight larger than a sled had been set to glide atop the snow. The reindeer stamped and hummed. The men fell into motion, fastening their fur-adjusting harnesses. I unlatched the tent to find the world a pale, indrawn thing. There, where the sullen tree line met the open, a shape stood, white upon white, the edges indistinct as if painted in fog. It made no sound save that subtle push of air. It did not cast a shadow beneath the aurora, and yet the lantern light on our sledge picked up forms like a suggestion of muscle or of fur matted with hoarfrost. Urvan moved forward, slow, his hands making the same signs he had drawn in the snow. Tolos' voice broke as he spoke the one word they used for it: stranger. I raised the rifle because that was the work of a fieldman. My hand trembled for cold rather than fear. My assistants whispered about tracks. There were none leading to it, and close around the figure the snow was oddly smoothed, as if a great hand had finished the surface with a palm. It did not approach so much as resolve into a direction it leaned toward us, and our reindeer took alarm in a way I had never seen. Bucking, breaking harness, a single sledge turning on its runners. In the confusion, one of our nenets, young Mikhailo, went for a tether and was jerked from his feet. I remember the jolt of the sledge, the crunch of wood, the high, thin cry cut off in the white. We flung ourselves into motion. The rifle barked once, more in spite than precision. The report seemed to pass through the shape and come back spent. For a long breath, the stranger stand where it had been, then turned, moving southward with an economy that made the snow smell like ice and old milk. We chased until the dawn paled the aurora. Tracks resumed beyond a short reach, long single depressions in the drift, spaced as if by great feet, and then nothing. Mikhailo was gone. We found only where he had been dragged. The snow dragged smooth and set with a ring of tiny hair, white as linen, and a smear of frozen blood that had already turned to dark lace under the cold. There was no sign of a struggle beyond that barren circle, no torn cloth, no footprints leading away. We left the plain in haste. The Society's papers and my own journal preserved the chronometer reading, and the plate negatives I managed to make in the flurry. It is these images, blurred and halting, that show a pale bulk. Against the tree line, nothing more. Officially, we reported a misadventure, a lost man, and weather that defeated us. Privately, Urvan would not return to that slope, and Tolo refused to tend reindeer there ever again. My assistants would not speak of the nights, but one told me, years later, that he had dreamed always of the white stranger's face as a blank where breath should have been. The Academy archived the notes. The photographs faded. Mikhailos' absence became a cautionary name in Nenet's camps. Leave the last birch, do not walk alone under a green night. I continued to map and to catalogue, but the plain beyond that last scrub remained, for me, an altar of unanswered questions. Whatever had moved there had done so without sound, and without leaving a full account for us. It had taken and left the world otherwise intact, and it has since sat in my memory like a sealed compass, pointing, but to no place I could read. We first found evidence not 10 minutes beyond our last cairn, where the pack snow lay swept hard and glassy by the northerly wind. The depressions cut across it like a faint road, shallow and elongated, each a low furrow rather than a print. They measured, upon my tape, rarely more than 2 handspans wide and some 5 or 6 feet in length, repeating at irregular intervals for nearly 20 yards, as if something had lain down and shifted itself along the surface. They did not match the cloven traces of the reindeer, nor the compacted pads of the sledge dogs. I knelt and pressed the barrel of my compass into the snow and tasted the metallic tang of cold these grooves had weight to them, not merely impression. Nearby lay 2 harnesses, the leather stripped at the throat and chewed, twisted as if by a jaw of great force. The raw hide had been torn in a spiral, the buckles bent outward. I could find no cut or blade that would produce such ragged work. Mikhail, my assistant, on hands and knees, found the sledge runner half a pelt length away, its iron sheathing sheared clean, as if struck by a wedge with the speed of a hammer. The fracture was sharp and bright under the frost, and where the wood had splintered, it smelled faintly of resin and hot metal, as though the break had been sudden. We set to our duties as measured men. It was January by my log, the 6th day of the month, and our instruments were as any scientific party would carry: a pocket sextant, a brass chronometer I had wound each morning, a set of spare percussion caps for the signal pistol, and for the old black powder fowling piece kept for wolves. Our guides, 3 nenets, all taciturn and wrapped in reindeer skins, ran their hands along the broken harnesses without surprise, though their eyes grew narrow. They spoke among themselves in low syllables I did not comprehend. At last, the eldest, Yule, shook his head and tapped his forehead with 2 fingers, a gesture none of us had seen in the journals. He would not be coaxed to come further without a fair recompense, and the promise we would not travel after dusk. That night, I discovered the caps. I had been minded to count them so as to be sure of our reserve, and set a dozen upon the snow to cold test them under the lantern. They crumbled between my fingers like fine ash. Their metallic smell was gone, replaced by a curious dry dust that would not hold the light of a spark. When I placed a cap upon the nipple and drew my hammer down, the blow produced nothing but a cold percussion and a little powder that sifted away like snowfall. Mikhail tried his own pistol, an old percussion piece he had been taught to favor by the steppe hunters, only to find the same: powder in place, no ignition. We burned a cap in the stove of our tent and watched it smoke like burnt sugar, not with the flash one expects. Whatever had reduced them had done so cleanly and without heat. The nights themselves altered the senses more than any object. There were moments when a pressure seemed to settle over the camp, an almost physical weight, and sound fell away as if someone had muffled the world with wool. The sleigh bells and the creak of harness, the crack of the stove, each would fade until the vast plain beyond the hut became an absolute hush. Our dogs, trained and industrious, went mute in those hours. Long before dawn, the lead dog would fix its muzzle into the wind and refuse to bay. One of the guides, under his breath, would spit and poke the coals of the lamp with the butt of his knife, as though to restore the ordinary noises of life. On the 3rd morning after the harnesses, while we made a small examination of the furrows with rule and tape to record their recurving, I saw it, if sight can be the word. Beneath the pale band of the horizon, where the birch and lichen broke to open tundra, a white shape lay like a dab of unworked bone, larger than any wolf and quieter than any beast I had known. It did not run. It did not stride. For a scant breath, it seemed to rise on the snow as if a veil were lifting, and then it slipped again into the same long, shallow furrow. Mikhail met my eye, and without a word, checked the chronometer and the compass, and then his hand closed upon the signal pistol. But there were no usable caps. Our runners were impaired. The guides would not go as we wished. We could make a map of what we had found. We could note the angle of the marks, the torn leather, the powdered metal. Yet the thing itself remained an outline beyond reach, white on white, a silent motion at the edge of the world. We did not press forward then. We pulled back our tent flaps and set an extra watch. When the first watch called at 2, they found only the furrows and the bent iron. The white shape was gone, as if it had never been, and the night held its hush. We slept little, and what sleep we had was threaded with the thought of that clean break in the runner and the taste of ash upon old percussion caps. At first light, I saw it at the tree line, a broad white form standing taller than a man, its outline nearly the color of the snow, but distinct against the dark trunks, moving without a single crunch or break in the drift. The reindeer bolted our percussion rifles misfired in the breathless cold, and when my men shouted, the thing made no answering sound, only a slow, deliberate glide that left no visible tracks behind it. We had been commissioned by the Imperial Russian Geographical Society to chart the reindeer roads that spring. A narrow party of 5 with a sled, a theodolite lashed beneath a tarpaulin, a sextant and chronometer for verifying latitude, tins of tea and salted fish, and 3 Nenets guides whose knowledge of herd and wind was the true map. It was March, the sun a pale coin at the horizon, and the tree line stood like a black stave against the tundra. Our guides, wrapped in reindeer felt and fur, moved with a quiet that I had come to mistake for stoicism. On that morning, their faces were not stone, but very small islands of alarm. I remember the smell of their breath, iron and soot, and the sharp tang of smoke from our small stove, and the sudden thud of hooves as the lead reindeer leapt sideways. The rifles were percussion locks, fouled by cold and handled under numb fingers, the cap stuck, and cold made powder bulk. Vasily struck and struck again, the flint useless but for a dry, hollow clap. I remember the metallic taste of adrenaline and the sound of our own breathing, ragged under the furs. We shouted the old Russian commands. The guides uttered terse Nenets words and pointed. The white shape did not turn toward us. It glided along the dark line of trunks, as though the trees were ashore, and it a slow boat. We pursued as men will pursue what they do not understand. We dropped the sled and hauled the theodolite toward the sapling stand. The snow there betrayed us. It was wind-pressed, a crust above powder, and where we expected a trail, there was nothing but the curve of wind. Ivan, the senior guide, crouched and ran gloved fingers over the surface until I could see frost on his knuckles. He signaled with a thumb and shook his head. "No marks," he said in Russian, and his voice had the precise, tired calm of a man who had taught his tongue to bear witness. Not man, not wolf. We followed the broad arc the shape had taken, reading the land as a navigator reads stars. For 18 minutes we advanced, the theodolite abandoned between 2 snowdrifts, our boots making soft dent and then filling. The white thing moved away from the open into older pines, and at the spot where we thought it must have passed, the snow lay as if untouched. No displaced lichen, no broken twig, no scuff of hide against bark. Only a small tuft of down, finer than reindeer, caught on a low branch like a question. I took it between thumb and forefinger. It was colder than the air and had the flat, papery feel of bird feather, though its fibers were not feathered but smooth. Night fell long before we reached our appointed camp. We sat around the Iwat's kerosene lantern with frozen hands and hot tea and traded sparse observations. One of the guides, a man I had seen laugh easily, refused at last to look at the map for the southern pass. He said only that the herds had been thin around that stand since his father's time, had given way to other grounds. He used an old word in Nenets that the others would not translate. We placed the tuft in the brazier for a moment and watched it blacken but not burn in the way animal hair does. Then we wrapped it in oilcloth and hid it in my journal. In the days that followed, the animals were skittish. A dozen chosen reindeer fled 3 times during lightless watches and were gone when we rose. We recovered 2 with the guide's patient tracks, but one was never found. Our report to St. Petersburg received the formal respect. Due a field note, the map was amended with the barest glyph. and the society appended an oblique remark about local superstition. The men who had seen the white form kept their faces set in that same small way, and they would, in the years after, refuse to guide along the same timber. I, who had measured latitudes and logged longitudes, could only measure the unnerving lack it left. A gap on our charts where industry of explanation failed. We left the Yamal tree line within a fortnight, our theodolite intact, our chronometer unbroken, but with fewer animals, and with that single scrap of down folded into my notes. I have carried it long after the society's stamps faded, a pale shard of the day when empiricism met something that answered with silence. The guides spoke seldom of the thing thereafter, and when they did, it was in whispers that turned to proverbs. The route was marked in their memory and avoided in the long migrations. The survey was completed, the maps were drawn. Yet on my page of coordinates, there remains, beside the ink of latitude and the clean stamp of a commission, an empty margin where the white shape passed, and a question that no measurement could fill. We withdrew that day, leaving 2 sledges and several animals behind, and the motion of our retreat seemed to draw the white from the air itself. The commission that had sent us, the provincial surveyor's office at Tobolsk, acting on instructions received in the spring of 1908, had furnished us with a theodolite, a sextant, a chronometer, a stout compass, and maps inked by men who had not set foot beneath that tree line. Our guides were Nenets of the Yamal tundra, seasoned by seasons of reindeer and wind. They moved with a patient economy of motion I had come to trust. Yet even their faces, usually as placid as old birch, bore the tight look of a man who had seen more in 1 minute than he could tell in many words. We had been making astronomical observations in a pocket of late daylight when the thing crossed the low stand of larch. I remember bending to secure a loose sledge runner with twine, the leather of my gloves stiff with frozen grease. I remember the smell of boiled pemmican and reindeer fat from our kettles, the thin blue smoke coiling to the pale sky. The air had been so still that the click of the theodolite's adjustment screw seemed loud as a bell. Then came that passage, a white shape moving without sound, as if the snow itself had parted for it. It was neither animal I recognized nor wind-sculpted drift. It gave no cry. It seemed to glide, and the undergrowth of small birch and lichen stood bent in its wake, not torn, but arranged as if someone had smoothed a cloth. We could not pursue. One of the Nenets, a man I had learned to call Ilya, counted noses and checked traces. The spoor that remained by the scrub were not hoof nor paw. 2 of the reindeer we had borrowed jerked at their harness and would not follow. Their eyes stared wide as if remembering something beyond the range of sight. By evening, a jelly-like stiffness had set into the ropes of the abandoned sledges. By midnight, the air grew so cold, the ink in my field book trembled when I tried to write. We lashed canvas to what remained and readied to move. The decision to leave behind property was not taken lightly. Survey practice required that all instruments be accounted for. A theodolite left unguarded lost more than metal. It lost the labor of months. Yet the choice was plain enough. An area around the tree line bore evidence of whatever had passed. Nets of bent larch, scorched-looking lichen, and a peculiar absence, no small birds, no fox tracks, gave a pattern I did not wish to test. We lashed what we could to the remaining sledges, distributed our charts and the chronometer into canvas rolls, and put up the white flag of prudence. At the magistrate in Beriozovo, I filed a terse report. I made mention of the Nenet's statements and of our own observations, noting coordinates by chronometer and sextant, and sketching the tree line with the care of a man who must answer for lost property and the reputation of his superiors. The clerk wrote our words into the provincial ledger in a hand as dry as winter dust, and, after a moment, added a line that was more practical than theoretical. Abandoned sledges at Lat. 68 degree 1, 12th. N. Caution advised. The Nenets returned to their summer pastures in measured language, trading the story as one trades salted fish, sparingly and with exactitude. They did not embellish, they marked the place with a refusal, and left our question where it had begun. I annotated my map with a single warning, a short note in the margin beside the sketched tree line. It was not a flourish, it was a stipulation for those who might follow. Do not camp within 2 versts of the larch stand at this bearing. Men who had been with us would later show that mark to others, pointing with a thumb and offering it as an explanation when they altered a route or abandoned a favored hunting ground. The white shape itself was never identified. No specimen was taken, no photograph captured, only absence and rearranged habit testified to its passing. In the ledger, the entry remained an unanswered line, and in the years that followed, families altered migration patterns in subtle, practical ways. Hunters pitched tents elsewhere. Caravans chose longer, safer detours. A trail that had once led directly toward the tree line thinned and fell out of use. I carry that map still. The ink faded, but the warning intact. It is a small, stubborn thing. Like a bone in a closet, it asks for explanation and receives none. When I think of that day, it is not the shape itself that holds me, but the silence it left behind, and the way a single passage through larch can reorder the habits of men and beasts alike.